budget to build a big condo. That would be what we call the developer. They are essentially the main decision maker because it's their building that is being built, and they have final say on everything. Okay. But you also have the architect. The architect designs the building. So remember, this is about, can we get our product in the building? So the door hinges, the door locks, the bath hardware, the towel bars, all that stuff. And I didn't realize what a big business it is, but it's huge because there's lots of buildings going up in North America. And so the architect is in charge of doing the design. You then also have the interior designer. Interior designers are not architects. They are actually extremely well trained in their own field, and they are in charge of the look and the feel and the aesthetic of the building. So even though the architect is designing the building, the interior designer is actually writing what's called a specification. What specifically is going to be going into the bathroom? Okay. You have then the general contractor. The general contractor builds the building. And so one of the problems here is that buildings oftentimes will run over budget. And even though Taymor product may be specified in the design by the interior designer or the architect and approved by the developer, when you're $5 or $10 million over budget, the general contractor is doing everything they can to cut costs. And there's a term that they call value engineering. Value engineering is a dirty word. Value engineering is when the specification gets flipped, meaning the thing that was written in the specification doesn't actually get built. And we try to find something that has equivalent functionality at a lower cost. And that costs Taymor jobs because they're pretty high-end product. And even though they might be specified in the project, we actually end up losing the job because of cost overruns. And the general contractor is making that decision with the project owner and the architect, and unfortunately the interior designer may not be part of that conversation. So even though you might be in great with the interior designer to get specified in the job, in the 11th hour you lose the job because they're not at the table. Okay? Then you have what's called the hardware supplier. The hardware supplier supplies the hardware to the contractor so that it gets installed. And what I found astounding, I could not believe, I did not believe it when they told me, and I fought back on this a lot, and I was just, now I understand. But even though this building is going to take like 2 years to build, what is actually in stock in a hardware supplier will be sometimes preferred, even though you got specified, because you may not be dealing with the hardware supplier, for instance, that's in Dallas, Texas, supplying the job. Even though everyone's on board with your product going in, your product actually doesn't get put in because it wasn't in stock in the hardware supplier. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different stakeholders. And each has various levels of influence, and the level of influence is not constant. It changes over time, and a whole bunch of shit can happen that ends up losing the job. So we wanted to map the path to purchase. What happens over time amongst these 5 different stakeholders in terms of how something actually ends up in a building? And so we spent about 18 months in total, but really about 6 months of really hard work actually understanding how this works, and it can work in different ways. And so I'm going to show you a diagram that we ended up using, and last summer we did sales training where we trained the whole organization on this. So this was done by the people internally, but they hired one of my MBA students, and I walked them through all this stuff, basically. So you have a concept where you're building from the developer, and you have the interior designer and the architect work on what's called the finishing schedule, which is a specification of what we're going to build. There then goes out to be a tender package issued by the general contractor, and the general contractor then issues what's called a takeoff schedule that goes to the distributors. But then sometimes it can be flipped, depending on the approval of the architect or the designer. And so this thing kind of sometimes circles back a few times, but we actually mapped out what can happen in various situations. And so the path to purchase, there's like multiple pages of these because it can different things can happen. It's almost like a flow chart. Like this might happen, this might happen, this might happen. And we mapped this out, and essentially you had a sales force that sometimes they won the job because they built a building for that developer before, and they had a really good relationship. And there's dollars like this with Timor in there. But some developers have a preference to put in like Moment or some other contractor, right? So the sales force out there. Basically, the company didn't really understand interior designers very well. They just thought they're the same as architects. We put together what was called a designer council, where we outreached to certain prominent interior designers and said, look, we're Timor. We're not trying to get your business. We just want to spend time learning about your world. And when hardware companies like us interact with you, what do you hate about our industry, about the way we operate? Timor, as well as others, you don't need to name names, but how do hardware manufacturers interact with you in ways that you like and dislike? And we learn a whole bunch of stuff that are industry norms that they hate. And Timor is now really doing well with these guys because we're the first company that's ever actually outreached to them to really understand their world. And now we're the manufacturer of preference for them, for a lot of these guys. And the interior designers that do a lot of stuff in Vancouver are not the same interior designers that are doing stuff in California or Dallas or Denver or New York City. So this is very regional. So this is a perfect example where they had a sales force for the last 30 years, but nobody really understood all the terms. They had pretty good relationships with some developers and some architects, but this was a huge opportunity for them to do better. Okay. Same thing with general contractors. But basically, the firm just started being a lot more disciplined in reaching out to stakeholders who it really knew and didn't understand. And instead of saying, well, assuming that they won't talk to us, let's just see if they will. And it's been a game changer. So their win percentage is way up now. They've been in the United States for 20 years, basically running it on the presumption that those markets run the same way as Western Canada, and they don't. And the way it works in California is, the way it works in San Francisco is not the same as San Diego, it's not the same as Dallas. Because the relationships between the players is always different. But now what they're able to do, I'll show you the next piece, okay, is we came up with a sales playbook. And I'll use a sports analogy here. I hate sports analogies. I hate the Yankees because I'm a Red Sox fan. But if you look at a picture of Derek Jeter playing shortstop, this is how we explain it. And the reason all this got done is because the CEO, she's incredibly intelligent, well-disciplined. She realized that this stuff would have value, and it was like, this is what we're doing. And the top down, not too much pressure, but it was like, there was buy-in from the very senior level of the organization, and it's been a game changer for them. So, if we look at, here's a good example, okay? So Derek Jeter is a shortstop, and in the game of baseball, if you're not familiar with it, shortstop is a real skill position because you can really change where you stand in the field. You're positioned between second and third base, if that's where the batter is, okay? And Derek Jeter spends a shitload of time with the coaching staff scouting every single batter of every team that they play. And he knows every player, what their batting percentage is, on-base percentage, where they're likely to hit the ball, but dependent on if it's a fastball versus a slider versus a curve, all these variables. But the point here is Derek Jeter doesn't play baseball the same way twice. He asks himself, where do I need to position myself to increase my likelihood of making a play? And so this is all about read the play. And in a top sales organization, you oftentimes will have people that kind of have their approach or their stick. They have their script, they have their approach, and they kind of apply that approach the same way in every situation. And it makes no sense to do it that way. Right? When you think about, and we don't teach you guys personal selling, but the whole point here is, how would you position yourself to be in a position of influence? Rather than assuming that this shit is out of your control and is dictated to you, get in and start influencing the play. So the idea here is if we map the path to purchase, and then we start looking at the various levels of influence of these different stakeholders, we would respond differently. So we came up with what we call, for lack of a better term, a subway line. A subway line is now more like a project tracking. So this is more similar to what I did with Laureate Institute. So you got mapping the path to purchase in terms of the interactions amongst the stakeholders. Now we have Taymor's internal sales process. So the first thing that comes in is what they call simple rules. There's a set of criteria that have to be met for them to want to pursue a job. It's a set of minimum requirements. So one is it look like there's at least $10,000 in hardware going in the building. So if it's like a four-story walk-up with like 15 residential units, they just give that to inside sales. They don't waste their time on outside stuff. Okay. At the pre-spec stage, so the idea here is what we learned is that even after you're specified to be put in the building, you might win or lose the job. Because if we actually look at the outcomes from what's happened in the past, it's not for sure that being specified leads you to win the job, because you can be flipped, value engineered, as I explained. So we've coded this from this point on. Until you're installed, you can win or lose. And that's what the red and the green bars mean. Very simple, right? And so what we found as we look back is a lot of salespeople, once they were specified, they never followed up with any of those stakeholders ever again. They just assumed the job was in the book. And their boss would find out, but was never necessarily sharing the information down and being like, why wasn't there any follow-up? We now know, given that we're specified, what's the percentage of those jobs that are specified that we actually win versus not win. And we're looking at our success rate all the way through. So a red line shows that when you can be flipped after the spec, and a green line shows an opportunity to value engineer after spec. So maybe you didn't get specified, some other company did, but maybe you can value engineer them. We would never want to be value engineered, but our approach to go after a job where we're not specified, we could be more aggressive because there'd be a minimum profit that we'd be looking at. We would gladly take that opportunity. Okay, so at the specified stage, best case scenario is our brand is the spec. Alternatively, you could be what's called in the industry a list. I know some of this is like detail that you don't care about, but it's to give it context because you could be looking at how this works in the industry. A listed equivalent is you're not the preferred brand, but you do have product that is equivalent to the preferred brand, and you can be asked to be listed as an equivalent in the spec. So you're not the preferred brand, but hey, Taymor also has product here that could work. And so you might have an architect, a developer, or an interior designer that you don't have an awesome relationship with to get you spec'd, but you'd work them to say, could we be listed as an equivalent on the spec so we can continue to pursue the job? Okay? Or third outcome is that you're not specified at all. Okay? So in the beginning, we can either pursue, delegate, or close the opportunity. Okay? And then we could try to have Taymor default is like, they don't even actually look at the product, they say, we're putting Taymor in. And they'll just use a specification sheet from some other building they built in the past. Why? Because they don't want to do the work. They're just lazy. They're like, just write in Taymor 1948 series or whatever, right? Versus, we're not the default, but they're interested, versus they're not interested. Okay? Now, by coding it as one of these three outcomes at this stage, we can then look on those separate paths. Out of all the times that we're the default, what percentage of the time did we actually get installed? Out of the times that they were interested and we weren't the default, how many times did we get installed? How many times we were not interested did we not get installed? And then at the specified stage, right, where we specified, let's look equivalent or value engineer. At the quoted stage, we either got quoted or not quoted. So sometimes you don't get quoted, like what the hell happened? We can look at what is that outcome as a percentage of whether or not we were specified versus listed or equivalent. So it's kind of like now a poker game, and you're looking at every stage. Are we still in the game? And does the outcome lead to winning or losing a hand? And so we've just put this program in place because we've redone their CRM system. And by next summer, we'll have our percentages, and they can start adjusting their play like Derek Jeter adjusted play. Okay? So we added this like verbal, there's a point where you get a verbal commitment. And we added this like, yes, it's not just yes or no. Sometimes like, yeah, they give it, but we can, the salesperson like, something's not right here. They're like, kind of fishy. So we actually have a category in the CRM system called fishy. Right? We got a strong verbal commitment. We didn't get the verbal commitment, or they are, but they seem to be kind of waffling. And we're gonna find out whether or not that's a red flag warning system. And we think it is, but we'll find out with the data. And we can figure out how many times that this gets. So now, rather than training your salespeople like, do everything you can to just win the job, you're actually be like, be honest. Does it feel fishy? If so, say so. Code it as such. We want to know what the outcome percentage is on these things. So everything in the organization now is just like, look, don't try to hide this. Code it. Be as accurate as you can. Right? We're going to see how we do, and then we can adjust our game plan. So was the purchase order received? Yes or no? Was the product shipped? Because you might find, like all the times, like everything's fine, but then the product didn't get shipped, and we can figure out, did we recover from that problem and still get installed? Or if the product didn't get shipped, now because we screwed things up with the hardware supplier, we lose a job, and there's no chance that it'll get back. These guys are so much more on top of their shit. Right? And no one has enough time for all the opportunity, but they're being really, really selective of which things they're pursuing, and they're going to learn from the system. So we are in measure and adjust mode right now. We are no longer naive optimists, and we're no longer dead end. We got better measurement, right? And we got everybody in the US and Canada on the system. And in the summertime, we can evaluate to see what our fielding percentage is, right? And start making adjustments. And we might find that the way we play the game in Dallas, so these guys are the leaders in Canada, but in the United States, they're in Washington State, Oregon, California, and Texas. And there's some shit that they're going after in New York, but it's kind of like testing the waters. We can look at this region by region. And in the CRM system, at every one of these stages, we have what's called a power ranking. And there's a scale of 0 to 10 for every one of these. And the salesperson at every stage is checking in going, okay, right now who's most powerful? And we're going to be able to see, right, when the interior designer has the highest power ranking, what's our win percentage? Versus when, to that level of detail, figure out who's got influence when and where are we winning. Let's stop going after jobs with BOSA properties, because when those guys have the power, we never win the fucking job, or we only win 10% of the time. We'll figure that out. So we're populating the observations this year. And that's the most sophisticated system I've seen. But that's just taking my 1994 Laurier Institute tick marks on the back of a piece of paper and trying to institutionalize it with a medium-sized organization. I mean, it's worth millions of bucks. The learnings here are worth millions. And we can increase profitability without increasing the size of the sales force, because we're just going to be better players. I can't give you the slides because it's there. So, one thing, we've got some pretty old school salespeople that are pretty rigid. We try our best to get them to see the light, and we have, for the most people, like guys, like they have these kind of walk sets. They're like, it's essentially a walk set that's on a mount, and you oftentimes will take these mounts and you go in and do pitches to be like, show the architect, show the interior designers, here's our product, etc. And they're always like, you know, this is how great. Like, why are you even spending the time to break down the walk set before you ask questions around things that, like, the interior designer in terms of what is the design philosophy of the building? The interior designer is saying, your people are using contemporary and modern interchangeably. They don't mean the same thing in the interior design world. This is what contemporary means, and they show us a deck of like, this is what this like. These things have definitions. The language of interior designers is really specific, and they can tell in an instant if a salesperson doesn't know what they're talking about, because it's like if we're talking about statistics, and you make it, if you use a certain population where you need sample, I'm like, no, you don't understand what the fuck you're talking about. Like, I know you're not trained, like you don't get it. So we've increased this, like the ability of the sales force to communicate with these stakeholders is just gone up like this. And why? Because they were, I guess, you know, what's the term? We're not afraid to ask the questions that would reveal that they don't know, but the fact is they don't know. So why don't you fucking learn? And just own up to the fact that you have no idea how to